Good to see all of you here on this great Sunday morning. I wanted to take a moment to thank Ed specifically that, having the ability to come up and speak in front of people can be an extremely terrifying thought for many people. And it takes a lot of courage to want to come up and preach God's word to other people, and that could be really, really terrifying. But all you have to do is you just got to put yourself out there. You just got to do it one time. After that, it's all easy as cake, because you're talking to people that you love, you're talking to people you care about, and they'll support you whether it was good or bad. Not saying that his was bad, he did a great job, but they'll love you through it no matter what. So this morning, as we get right into this lesson, I'd like to take a look at these particular individuals that we should all strive to mold our lives like. These particular people, they're part of the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament is there for our learning, it's there for our admonition, it's there for us to look back on our past and see where we came from and see where we're trying to be. These particular people, they tried their absolute best to follow God and to show His reverence and always put Him first no matter what. Now, those particular people I'm talking about are Daniel and his friends. Now, from the very beginning, Daniel and his compatriots had distinguished themselves amongst even the people of his own country. These people were very godly individuals. Now, what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at three key aspects of Daniel and his friends and how we ourselves should try to demonstrate what they are trying to tell us, to truly live a faithful life in a world where that may be extremely challenging, where your faith is challenged on an extremely regular basis. Now, as we look at these points, I want you to ask yourself two particular questions. I want you to ask yourself, number one, do we remain faithful to God in a world that opposes our faith? And number two, if we do remain faithful, how do you do it? How do you do that? Now, I ask these specific questions because it's really important, especially for newly baptized Christians, that there's nothing scarier than having to step out into a brand new world, not having anybody to try to rely on. Now, there are people in this audience today who've been baptized for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Now, those individuals who have been baptized for that long, they can be that shoulder of comfort for those new people coming in, that there's nothing more comforting to know that someone says, hey, I know what you're going through. I know what that's like. I know the struggles of what it means to be a new Christian. Let me help you. Now, Daniel and these young men, as they were taken into captivity in Daniel chapter 1, we are told that in the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign, he was the king of Judah, that Nebuchadnezzar came in and besieged Judah, and God let Nebuchadnezzar take Judah. And like any military win, there is going to be plundering. They are going to take the goods of the land for their own, and this particular battle between Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim was no different. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar took over Judah, he instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring the children of Israel to him and some of the nobles. And these young men, these children that they were supposed to bring, they weren't just anybody. They didn't just let anybody come in and be part of them. What they had to have was they couldn't have any blemishes. They had to be good looking. They had to be gifted in wisdom. They had to be knowledgeable and quick to understand things. They had to have the ability to serve in the king's palace. So that way one day, as these eunuchs were to bring them up, they too could lead and help guide the king in the things that he wanted to do. Now with that, the perk of being one of these children is this. These young men, they were able to partake of the delicacies of the king himself. They were able to eat what the king ate, and they were able to drink what the king drank, which is going to be the best of the best. There were no reservations when it came to what the king was able to eat. They would train these young men up for about 3 years, so that at the end of this training, they would hope to stand apart and serve the king. Now, these four men that came were Daniel, who was later renamed Belshazzar, Hananiah, who was renamed Shadrach, Mishael, who was renamed Meshach, and Azariah, who was renamed Abednego. Now, as we look into these three different aspects of Daniel and his friends' lives, I want you to really take a look at yourself, and I want you to take a look from within and see where you can try to emulate what Daniel and his friends were able to do. The first point that we're going to be looking at today is being faithful in the small things. So if you would, if you have your Bibles or if you have your phones, please turn over to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to start in the first chapter of Daniel, and we're going to read and we're going to start in verse number 8. And it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine in which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel in the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men's who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had set out over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servant for 10 days and let them give vegetables to eat and water to drink." Now this is really interesting because the eunuch understood that if all you were to eat was vegetables and water versus your somebody who was serving next to you and all they had was the best of the best in which the king had to offer, the eunuch understood who was going to look better at the end of these 10 days. He knew that. And he feared for his own life because he said that the king may even have my head because I okayed this. Now, Daniel and his compatriots, they knew that this was not going to be the case. So let's be real honest with ourselves. If someone came to you and said, hey, I'm going to put a platter of what the king is able to eat right in front of you, or you can have your choice of just eating nothing but vegetables and water, which one would you pick? I know which one I'm picking. I barely eat vegetables with the great food that my wife likes to make me at home. I'll eat one green bean just to say that I did. Look, Daisy, I ate a green bean. Look, Jed, I ate a piece of broccoli. Or would you rather have the best of the absolute best that the king was willing to offer? Now, to anybody who has a worldly point of view, that was an easy choice. It was going to be the king's delicacies that they were going to have. But to Daniel and his friends, the choice was just as simple. They knew that if they were to pick these vegetables, they knew that their God would deliver them and it would not be a problem. Now, that's exactly what Daniel and his friends did. They elected to go these 10 days with just vegetables and just water, and they knew that they were going to be delivered no matter what. Now, if you skip down to verse 17, we're told that, and through the verses before that Daniel and his friends, they were delivered from this test. Because verse 17 tells us, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and the skills in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understandings in all visions and dreams. So because of their faith in God, that they knew that God was going to deliver them, they made the right decision. Even though this choice was small, this choice was really not that big a deal to really just have some of the king's delicacies. But they decided to choose the difficult route because they knew that they were not going to defile themselves with the king's delicacies. When it comes to your life, are you able to say the same thing? When the easy choice comes to you, do you choose to do right by God or do you choose to do evil? Would you have the courage to stand up for what is right and to stand up for God's commandments when the time comes, or do you turn your back on God? During those small trials, you'll be amazed that those little choices end up making a major difference when it comes to our lives. Now, point number 2 that I'd like to take a look at this morning is going to be Daniel and his friends, specifically his friends. Now, if you would, we're going to skip over chapter 2, and we're going to get right into chapter 3. In verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and his width 60 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps and the administrators and the governors, and the counselors and the treasurers, and the judges and the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to dedicate the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors and the treasurers, the judges and the magistrates, and all the officials of the province gathered together for a dedication of the image of King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image of Nebuchadnezzar had set, Then a herald did cry aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony, with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace." So at the time when all the people heard the sound of the horn and the flute and the harp and the lyre and the symphony with all kinds of music, all the peoples of the nation and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image in which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar set up this decree, everyone was required to bow down to this golden image when they heard the ensembles. What are you to do? Do you bow down because the government told you to? Do you do it because you're under pressure of punishment? Absolutely not. When we look at Scripture, real quickly, when we look at Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, it says this: "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists the ordinances of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same." Now, a lot of people will try to use this particular verse and claim that we are to obey the government no matter what they have to say. But we as Christians, if we really look at this verse, we have a little bit of a phrase here that is a bit of an upper hand, and it's in verse 3, and it says, "Do what is good." Now, God is the standard of what good is. Now, if the government is coming and telling you that you have to do something that is against God's will, are you to do it? Is it good or is it evil just because the government said so? It's evil. And Daniel and his friends, in this particular instance, his friends, they knew that. They knew that what the king was asking was evil. Now, reading through verses 8 and 11, it says, "Therefore, at a certain time, the Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews, and they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king,' he had made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace.'" Now, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they knew what the punishment was going to be if they didn't do it. But they didn't care because they knew that they were not going to defile themselves with what the Babylonians were trying to impose on them. These men, they knew the difference between right and wrong and what the expectation was of what God wanted from them. Now, these particular men, they spoke to Nebuchadnezzar and they said, "You know what? We're not going to do this." And of course, a king being a king was furious to being openly disrespected by these men, that they were not going to do what the king had forced them to do. Now, to really add insult to injury here, when the king questioned these men about their obedience, what did they say? I think we should look at the scripture to see exactly what they say, and this is exactly how we should deal with people today. Verses 14, it says, "Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods for worship, the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the time you heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony, with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the image which I have made good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hand?'" Now, these men, they didn't owe the king an answer, because in verse 16 it says, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, 'O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king.'" Now, here's really where they take that knife and they stab it into his chest and they turn it a little more. They say, "But if not, if for some reason our God does not save us, but if not, let us be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Now that is dedication. That they knew that if they said, you know what, King, even if that is not the case, that we go and we die inside of this furnace, know this, we still won't worship you. We still will not bow down to your image, even if they weren't saved. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew the punishment for their disobedience, and they chose to do the right thing anyways. Now, the king, of course, being completely full of fury, as we're told in verse 19, the king demanded that the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than normal. Now, I don't know much about how furnaces would work back in the day. I don't know how they managed that to happen. But I'm sure that anything that gets heated up 7 times hotter than where it would normally be has got to be a serious amount of heat. It was so hot, in fact, that the men that had bound these 3, when they threw them into the furnace, they were killed themselves. If that tells you how hot this furnace was. Now, they were thrown into the fire with no hesitation whatsoever, knowing full well that their God was going to deliver them. And when they were thrown in, a 4th man appeared, and he was described as being like the Son of God. Now, that's incredible, that these 3 men would be thrown into any furnace, whether it was 7 times hotter or not, and they would not be killed. After just seeing that these men that bound them to throw them in were killed instantly. Now, here's the incredible thing about God. When He performs a miracle, God does not perform some halfway performance. It's all or it's nothing. Now, when these men came out, their hair was not singed, their clothes was not affected, and even better, they didn't even have the scent of fire on them. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar, when he saw these things, he was astonished when he saw this. So astonished that he praised God himself. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had changed the decree based off of their conviction to God. Nebuchadnezzar, he ended up changing the decree to this land to say that if anyone spoke against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they wouldn't just be killed. No, that wasn't good enough. They would be cut into pieces. But the king didn't stop there. He said on top of being cut up into pieces, their house was going to be burned to ashes. In this world, do you have that kind of faith? That when you go out into this world, when people see you, they see the light of God. They see enough to be convicted themselves. Do they see that within you? Are you that convicted? We in the 21st century should have that kind of faith in our God, that no matter what we are facing, and it may not be a literal furnace, but to know that we would not change the way that we feel about our God. Now, point number 3, this is our final point. We're going to be looking at Daniel himself. We're going to be looking at being trustworthy in character. Now, about 2 kings later, Daniel is still under Babylonian reign. Nebuchadnezzar, he would be driven from mankind to eat grass as oxen do for a long time. His son would then take over, King Belshazzar, and he too would eventually see his demise at the end of chapter 5, and we're told that he was actually slain. Then from there, King Darius the Mede would receive the kingdom at a ripe age of 62 years old. Now, Daniel thus far has served under 3 different kings, and he has continued to succeed under each individual one up until this point. Now, King Darius, of course, it would be no different. You see, King Darius had set up that there were 120 satraps in the area, and they would be set forth in the kingdom. And above those 120, there was 3 governors, Daniel being one of these governors. So obviously, Daniel, he was in a clear point, in a position of power. And these satraps, they had to give accounts to Daniel, and they didn't like that. So what would they do? They tried to throw a little dirt on Daniel's name. Of course, because Daniel was as distinguished of a man as he was, he set himself apart from these men, and of course, they hated him for it. The people around him, they didn't want to see him succeed because they felt like they deserved the success, not Daniel. Now, of course, what did these men do? Just like anybody else who's wanting to succeed, these men, they tried to plot against Daniel, and they try to find any reason to try to throw him under the bus, so to speak. However, because Daniel was such a godly individual, they couldn't find anything on Daniel. So what did they have to do? They had to go as far as making something up for them to catch Daniel. So flip over a couple chapters to chapter 6, and we'll start in verse 6, So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and the satraps and the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions. Now, O king, establish this decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed this written decree. Now, isn't it interesting how these men approach King Darius? Hey, king, boy, you're so good. You don't deserve to have anybody else worshipped except for you. Way to puff him up. Way to really make him feel like he's better than the rest. That's the easy way to try to get someone to sign a decree. Now, he signs it, and he passes it. And these men, they were ready. They were ready to catch Daniel. Now, starting in verse 10, it says, Now when Daniel knew that these writings were signed, so Daniel knew about this decree. It was no secret. He went home in his upper room with his windows open towards Jerusalem, and he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since the early days. Now Daniel knew what the laws of the land were, but he didn't care. He knew that his God was the supreme being of life, so Daniel did exactly what Daniel had always done. He went up and he prayed toward Jerusalem 3 times a day like he did when he was younger. And of course, these men, they knew that. They knew that this was going to happen, so they caught him in the middle of the act. Now, interestingly enough, the king obviously had some sort of connection with Daniel because we're told in verse 14 that the king was very displeased with himself. So he tries to help Daniel. We're told that he paced back and forth until the sun went down to try to help Daniel because he didn't want to throw them into the lion's den because he knew that he would be throwing him in to certain death. Now, as Daniel, what do you think Daniel was thinking? What was going through his mind? Now, Daniel has broken the law. He's facing severe punishment. He's almost facing certain death at this point. And that's exactly what the satraps and the kings are all thinking as well. Everyone was on the same boat that Daniel was about to lose his life. But you know, the only person that was not thinking that was Daniel. Now, I'm not a mind reader. There's no documentation on what the exchange between King Darius and Daniel is. But I can tell you exactly what was going through Daniel's mind. What was going through Daniel's mind is he knew that the God that he served was going to deliver him. And without a doubt, that's exactly what Daniel was thinking. Now, when Daniel heard this decree from the king, he knew the law. And the fact that he broke the law, if he prayed to God, that he didn't waver in that moment. He didn't look at that decree and say, you know what, the king is right, I shouldn't do this. No, he ignored it. And he did exactly what he thought was right. His character had remained unchanged regardless of what the laws of the land had to be. And he was right. Now, many of you may be thinking, boy, that was a heck of a gamble. But for Daniel himself, that was no gamble at all because he knew exactly what the outcome was going to be. He would be thrown into the lion's den. He could be thrown into a furnace, but he knew exactly what the outcome was going to be. We as Christians live in a world that being a Christian is considered social suicide. That the world will ridicule you to no end. But you have to be like Daniel where your character never wavers. It must never change. You have to be like Daniel. So as we look at ourselves, we'll have a quick recap and the lesson will be yours. 1, are you able to stay faithful to God even in the small things in your life? When the simple choices come up, the choice is to either follow God or follow the world. Which one do you choose? And do you choose accordingly? Number 2, are you able to stay courageous in the time of trials? When the trials come in the easiest times, that's the easiest time to try to walk away. But when it really gets down to the nitty-gritty, are you able to always proclaim your faith in God no matter what? And when the world comes at you with their fiery arrows, do you have the armor of God that will protect you? And finally, do you have a trustworthy character? When no one is watching, do you do the right thing? When you're around a different group of people, do they see God's light shine through? Or do they just see another worldly individual who's just one of their friends? The choice is always yours. I challenge you this morning to live like Daniel and his friends did, to be able to stand up to the trials that are thrown their direction, and to always put God first, because God will always deliver his people. In every situation, just as God delivered Daniel and his friends, he too will deliver you if you are faithful, if you are courageous, if you live a life that always honors God. If there's anything that we can do for you, why don't you please come forward as we stand and sing.